At some point during the awakening process, a quiet realization begins to emerge within you. At first it appears almost like a whisper, a feeling that is difficult to explain. Something inside you starts to sense that what we call awakening may not be exactly what we once imagined. For a long time, many people believe that awakening is a final destination, a point of arrival, a moment where all doubts disappear, all inner conflicts dissolve, and life finally reaches some kind of spiritual conclusion. But as time passes, something curious begins to reveal itself. Consciousness does not arrive at an ending. It keeps expanding. It keeps transforming. It keeps revealing new layers of the experience of being alive. And it is exactly at this moment that many people make a surprising discovery. Awakening was not the end of the journey. In many ways, it was only the beginning. And this realization can feel both liberating and deeply unsettling. Because if awakening is not the final destination, then what comes next? What path truly opens when consciousness begins to free itself from its old illusions? What is the real journey that begins after the old self starts to dissolve? These questions slowly begin to appear, and often they arise after someone has already passed through several stages of awakening. Perhaps you experienced that strange moment when you realized you no longer felt like the same person. Perhaps you noticed relationships beginning to change. Perhaps you felt that strange calm that appears when the mind stops fighting everything. Perhaps you experienced that confusing phase where reality itself starts to feel less solid. Perhaps you went through the difficult moment where your old sense of identity started to fade. Perhaps you faced that strange period where nothing seemed to matter in the same way anymore. And perhaps, little by little, you started to notice something new emerging inside you, a new form of guidance, a quiet inner compass, a deeper awareness that begins to guide decisions in a different way. If you have experienced these phases, then you may be beginning to realize something that many spiritual traditions have pointed to for centuries. Awakening is not an event, it is a process, a continuous transformation of consciousness. But there is something even deeper that is rarely discussed. Because many people talk about awakening, but very few talk about what happens after. What happens when consciousness can no longer return to the old way of seeing the world? What happens when you have seen too much to pretend you have not seen? What happens when the old illusions can no longer sustain the same reality? It is exactly here that the real journey begins. And this journey is very different from what most people expect. It does not look like a traditional spiritual search. It does not necessarily involve following new belief systems. It does not require adopting a new spiritual identity. In fact, the opposite often happens. The more consciousness awakens, the less need there is to create new identities. Less need to belong to labels. Less need to define yourself through rigid ideas about who you are. And this can feel very strange. Because for most of our lives, we were taught to build an identity. To develop a story about who we are. To construct a personal narrative that gives us a sense of stability. But when consciousness begins to awaken, something unexpected happens. That story becomes more flexible, more open, more temporary. And slowly we begin to realize something surprising. Perhaps we were never truly the story we believed ourselves to be. Perhaps identity has always been only a temporary way of organizing experience. Perhaps what we truly are is something much wider, much quieter, much harder to define. And it is exactly at this moment that something fascinating begins to unfold. Life stops being merely a sequence of events. It becomes a conscious journey of discovery. Each moment begins to carry a deeper meaning. Each encounter begins to reveal something about the nature of awareness itself. Each challenge begins to act like a mirror reflecting deeper layers of the self. And when we begin to notice this, a new question naturally arises. If awakening was only the beginning, then what is the real journey that begins now? That is the question we will explore in this video. Because the journey of consciousness does not end when we awaken. In many ways, it begins exactly there, and often it leads us to places the mind never imagined. But before we explore that deeper journey, there is something essential we must understand, something that completely changes how we see awakening itself, and that understanding begins with a simple question, a question that may seem small, but has the power to transform the way you see your entire life. The question is this: if awakening is not the final destination, then what does it truly mean to be alive? When consciousness begins to awaken, one of the first things that changes is not the world around you, it is the way you begin to perceive it. For a long time, the mind functions like an automatic filter of reality. It organizes everything through concepts, beliefs, and interpretations that we have accumulated throughout life. These filters create a sense of familiarity. They tell us what matters, what should be pursued, what should be avoided, what success looks like, what failure means, and without realizing it, We spend years living inside this invisible structure. We make decisions based on it. We build relationships within it. We plan our future according to it. But when the awakening process begins, something very interesting happens. These filters start to lose their power. Ideas that once felt absolutely solid begin to feel questionable. Certainties that once seemed definitive begin to soften. And gradually an unexpected realization emerges. Perhaps reality was never exactly as the mind described it. Perhaps much of what we called reality was actually interpretation. The mind always tries to organize the world into categories: right and wrong, success and failure, progress or regression. But when consciousness begins to expand, we notice something curious. Life is far wider than any concept the mind can create. And this realization slowly transforms how we relate to existence itself. Before awakening, life often appears like a straight line, a path that must lead somewhere. There are goals, objectives, a final imagined destination where everything will finally make sense. But as awakening deepens, the idea of a final destination begins to fade. Not because life loses direction, but because we realize that life was never truly about arriving somewhere. It was always about the process of living, about consciousness exploring itself through experience. And when this realization deepens, something remarkable happens. The pressure we once felt begins to dissolve. That constant feeling that we must achieve something before life finally becomes meaningful starts to fade away. Because we discover something simple yet profoundly transformative. Life does not need to be conquered. It needs to be lived. And that difference changes everything. Because when we stop treating life like a race toward a final destination, we begin to notice things that were always there. Small moments begin to feel meaningful. Simple conversations reveal unexpected depth. Silence itself begins to carry a presence we had never noticed before. Time stops feeling like a sequence of tasks. It becomes a conscious experience. But there is something even deeper in this process. Because when we stop searching for a final destination, a new form of curiosity naturally arises. A curiosity about consciousness itself. We begin observing our thoughts more carefully. We notice emotions appearing and disappearing within us. We start recognizing patterns that were once invisible, and gradually we discover something fascinating. Consciousness is not something fixed. It is a continuous movement of discovery. Every experience reveals something. Every challenge exposes another layer of what we do not yet fully understand. Every encounter with another human being becomes an opportunity to see ourselves more clearly. And this transforms the entire meaning of the journey. Because the journey stops being about finding final answers. It becomes about learning how to live with deeper and deeper questions. Questions that do not necessarily require immediate answers. Questions that function like doors into new levels of perception. For example, who am I beyond the stories I tell about myself? What exists before a thought appears? Who is the one that observes the thoughts? These questions are not meant to be solved intellectually. In fact, the mind often cannot answer them, but simply holding them opens a completely new space of awareness. A space where life is no longer just something happening to us. It becomes something we can observe with clarity, and within that silent space, a new form of intelligence begins to emerge. An intelligence that does not rely only on logical reasoning, an intelligence born from presence itself. It is this intelligence that begins guiding the real journey after awakening. But something important happens here, because when we begin living this way, many old structures of life begin to change. Certain ambitions lose their meaning. Some worries begin to appear smaller. Some priorities naturally rearrange themselves. And this can create discomfort, because the world around us still operates according to the old structures. But something inside you has already shifted. And this shift creates an unavoidable question. How do we live in the world without falling back into the old illusions? This question marks the beginning of a new phase of the journey. A phase that many people never truly explore. And that is exactly what we will explore next. Because when awakening matures, it reveals something most people are not prepared to see. The real journey of consciousness is not about escaping life. It is about learning how to live within it with a completely new clarity. Thank you for watching. If this resonates with you, consider subscribing for more on this journey. At a certain moment in the awakening process, something very interesting begins to happen. You start to notice that the way you live begins to change. Even if nothing externally has changed yet, the same streets are still there. The same people are still around you. The same world appears to function in the same way. But something within you is no longer relating to it in the same way. And this shift is extremely subtle. It does not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It does not come with grand announcements or absolute certainty. Instead, it appears as a quiet shift in awareness. a small internal movement that completely changes the way you experience life. Before awakening, most of your attention was directed outward, toward goals, achievements, the construction of identity, the constant attempt to find security in results. But when awakening matures, something begins to reorganize inside perception. Attention slowly turns inward, not as an escape from the world, but as a new way of observing it. You begin to notice your thoughts more clearly. You begin to see how certain emotions arise and disappear. You start observing old patterns that once felt completely natural, and slowly, a very interesting question appears. If I can observe my thoughts, who is the one observing? If I can notice my emotions appearing, who is the one noticing them? These questions may seem simple, but they hold extraordinary depth, because they reveal something fundamental about the nature of consciousness. For a long time we believed we were our thoughts, we believed we were our stories, we believed we were our emotions. But when we begin observing these things carefully, something surprising becomes clear. Thoughts come and go, emotions arise and disappear. Stories about who we are change over time. None of these things remain fixed, and if they constantly change, perhaps they are not what we truly are. This realization can be deeply transformative, because it creates space between you and what once felt like your identity. A space of awareness, a space where you can observe experience without becoming completely identified with it. And when that space begins to appear, something important happens. Life begins to feel lighter, not because challenges disappear, but because your relationship with them changes. Before awakening, every difficulty seemed like a threat to identity. Every problem felt like proof that something was wrong. But now these experiences begin to be seen differently. They become natural movements of life. Situations that appear, transform, and eventually disappear. And this changes the way you move through the world. Because when you are no longer completely trapped inside your mental identity, something interesting happens. You become more free to respond to life, more free to act with clarity, more able to perceive possibilities that once seemed invisible. But something important must be understood here. This freedom does not mean the absence of responsibility. It does not mean life becomes easy. In many ways, the opposite can happen, because when you begin seeing reality more clearly, you also begin seeing the complexity of existence. You begin to notice the consequences of actions. You begin to see how choices create ripple effects. And this naturally awakens a new kind of maturity, a maturity that does not arise from fear, but from awareness. You begin acting not only because something feels convenient, but because you recognize the connection between everything, between your actions, between other people, between the world around you, and this awareness transforms the way you live, because life stops being only a personal search. It becomes a conscious participation in existence itself. Each moment becomes an opportunity to act with presence, with clarity, with responsibility. And as this perception deepens, something even more interesting happens. The journey stops being about finding yourself. It becomes about expressing what you truly are. And this expression does not need to be dramatic. It appears in small moments, in the way you listen to someone, in the way you respond to difficult situations, in the way you make important decisions. Every gesture begins to carry a different quality of awareness. But this raises an important question. If awakening makes us more aware of life, why do so many people still feel confusion even after awakening? Why does the path sometimes feel even more uncertain? This question leads us to a crucial point in the journey. Because the true challenge of awakening is not perceiving consciousness. The true challenge is learning how to live from it. And that is exactly what we will explore next. When we begin to live from this new level of awareness, something very interesting happens. Life stops feeling like a problem that needs to be solved. For a long time we were conditioned to treat existence as a constant challenge, something that must be controlled, something that must be carefully planned, something that must be organized so that we can finally feel safe. But as awareness matures, we begin to realize something the mind often struggles to accept at first. Life was never a problem. It has always been a process, a continuous movement of transformation, a flow of experiences constantly unfolding moment after moment. And when we start to perceive this, something inside us relaxes, not because challenges disappear, but because our relationship with those challenges changes. Before awakening, every difficulty felt like a threat to identity. It felt like a personal failure. It felt like proof that something was wrong with the path. But when awareness deepens, something very different becomes visible. Challenges are not obstacles against life, they are part of life itself. They are natural movements within the growth of consciousness, and this realization completely changes how we walk through existence, because when we stop fighting life, we finally begin participating in it. And this conscious participation creates a new quality of experience, a quality that does not depend entirely on external circumstances. It depends on the presence of awareness within each moment. For example, imagine two people facing the exact same situation. One of them is completely identified with the thoughts that arise. Every thought triggers a reaction. Every emotion creates an immediate impulse. Life feels chaotic. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels threatening, but the other person observes the same situation differently. There is space between thought and reaction. There is a pause. There is presence. And inside that presence something powerful appears. Clarity. This clarity does not necessarily come from thinking more. It comes from observing more deeply, and when we observe life in this way, we begin noticing something that previously went unseen. Much of human suffering comes from resistance, from the constant attempt to make life different from what it is in this moment. The mind creates expectations, it builds ideas about how things should be, and when reality does not match those expectations, frustration appears, conflict appears, suffering appears. But when awareness awakens, we begin to see something incredibly liberating. Life does not need to match our expectations in order to have meaning. It simply needs to be lived consciously. This does not mean passivity. It does not mean accepting every situation without action. It means acting with clarity. It means responding to life rather than reacting automatically, and that difference is enormous. Because reacting is conditioned. Responding is conscious. Reaction is born from fear. Response is born from presence. And when we begin responding to life in this way, something profound begins to unfold. We start discovering a new kind of freedom. Not the freedom of controlling everything, but the freedom of being present with everything. And that freedom transforms the entire experience of the journey. Because now every moment becomes an opportunity for awareness. Every situation becomes an opportunity for learning. Every encounter becomes an opportunity to discover something new about the nature of existence. But here an important realization appears, because when we start living this way, something inside us begins to change deeply. The search for meaning begins to transform. Before awakening, we wanted to find a grand purpose, a final mission, something that would justify our entire existence. But as awareness matures, we discover something surprising. Perhaps life does not require a grand external purpose. Perhaps the true meaning of life is found in the experience of living consciously. Perhaps purpose is not something discovered in the future. Perhaps it is something expressed moment by moment through the way we live. And when this perception deepens, a new form of responsibility emerges. A responsibility that does not arise from external pressure. It arises from awareness. From the realization that every moment is an opportunity to live with greater clarity, greater presence, greater integrity. But this also raises an important question. If the real journey begins after awakening, how do we continue growing without falling back into the old illusions of the mind? That question brings us to the next step of the journey. Because there is a fundamental aspect of awareness that many people only discover after awakening, and understanding this aspect completely changes how we live our lives. As awareness matures after awakening, an important realization begins to emerge, something many people take time to fully understand. Awakening does not automatically remove all old mental patterns. In fact, many of those patterns may continue appearing for some time. Old thoughts still arise. Old emotions still appear. Certain conditioned impulses may still manifest. And this can feel confusing. Some people believe that after awakening they should live in a constant state of perfect clarity, as if all confusion should disappear instantly. But the reality of consciousness is much more organic. It resembles a maturation process. A gradual unfolding where different layers of the mind begin reorganizing themselves. For years, sometimes decades, the brain was trained to react automatically to certain stimuli. Certain thoughts trigger emotions. Certain emotions trigger behaviors. Certain behaviors reinforce patterns. And those patterns form what we call psychological identity. But when awareness begins to awaken, something fascinating happens. Those patterns do not disappear immediately, but now they become visible. And that changes everything. Because when a pattern is invisible, it controls our actions. But when a pattern becomes visible, it begins to lose its power. Imagine a thought of fear appearing within you. Before awakening, that thought might dominate your perception. It would become a narrative. The narrative would become an emotion. The emotion would turn into behavior. But when awareness is present, something different happens. The thought may still appear, but now there is space to observe it. You notice the thought emerging, you notice the emotion beginning to form, and within that space of observation, something powerful appears. Choice. This choice is not necessarily a rigid control over the mind. It is awareness, a clarity that allows you to respond differently. And this ability to respond consciously is one of the most transformative aspects of awakening, because it restores something many people never realized they had lost. Inner freedom. Freedom not to react automatically, freedom not to repeat old patterns, freedom to act with greater presence. But this freedom also brings responsibility, because once you begin seeing your patterns clearly, something inside you understands that every choice begins shaping the direction of your journey. Every thought you feed creates a path. Every repeated action strengthens a pattern. Every moment of awareness opens a new possibility. And this reveals something deeply important about the real journey after awakening. The journey of consciousness is not passive. It is an active participation in life. Participation in how you live. Participation in how you relate to the world. Participation in how you respond to experience. And slowly you begin to realize something that changes how you see your own existence. You are not simply someone moving through life. You are part of the very process of consciousness exploring itself. Each experience becomes a field of discovery. Each challenge becomes an invitation to deeper clarity. Each encounter becomes an opportunity to learn something new. And as this realization deepens, the journey begins to carry a completely different meaning. It stops being a search for a perfect state. It becomes a continuous expression of awareness. Expression through choices. Expression through actions. Expression through the way you live each moment. And at this stage, something interesting happens. The fear of making mistakes begins to fade, because you begin realizing that every experience, even the difficult ones, participates in the learning process of consciousness. Nothing is completely wasted. Everything can become growth. Everything can become an opportunity for deeper awakening. And as this understanding matures, life begins to feel very different. It stops being merely a sequence of events. It becomes a field of conscious evolution. But there is something even deeper within this journey. Because when awareness begins living in this way, an inevitable question appears. If awakening was only the beginning, how do we continue evolving without creating a new spiritual identity, without turning awakening into just another story of the mind? That question leads us directly to the final step of this video. If you made it this far, something inside you may have already noticed an important truth. Awakening was never the final destination. It was the moment you began to see. For a long time, the mind taught us that life should follow a predictable sequence. First you find answers, then you find stability, then you find happiness. But when awareness awakens, that narrative begins to dissolve, because awakening does not give ready-made answers. It removes illusions. It dissolves the stories the mind created to feel in control. And when those stories begin to fade, something very profound happens. Life stops being a story you try to control, and becomes a mystery you begin to explore. At first, this can feel uncomfortable because the mind loves certainty. It wants clear maps, it wants clearly defined paths, but awareness begins to see something different. Maybe life was never meant to be completely understood. Maybe it was meant to be lived with presence. And when this realization deepens, something interesting happens within us. The need to control the future begins to soften. The need to define every step begins to relax. And in place of that tension, something quieter emerges. Trust, not a trust based on external guarantees, but a trust born from awareness itself. A trust that appears when we realize that, even amidst constant change, something inside us remains stable. Presence, the awareness that observes, the clarity that begins to appear when we stop fighting the flow of life. And when we begin living from that presence, something curious happens. The journey stops feeling like a search for something missing. It becomes a continuous discovery. Each experience becomes an invitation to notice something new. Each encounter becomes an opportunity to deepen awareness. Each challenge becomes a doorway into deeper understanding. And slowly you begin to realize something that changes the way you see your life. Awakening was not the end of a journey. It was the beginning of a new way of living. A more conscious way. A more present way. A way that feels aligned with the deeper nature of existence. But there is something many people overlook at the beginning of this path. The real growth of awareness does not happen only in extraordinary moments. It happens in the small choices of everyday life. In the way you listen to someone. In the way you respond to difficulty. In the way you relate to your own emotions. Every moment becomes a space where awareness can deepen. And when we begin living this way, something beautiful happens. Life stops feeling like a lonely journey. Because we begin to see that every human being is walking through similar processes. Everyone is learning. Everyone is discovering. Everyone is trying to understand something about themselves. And when we recognize this, a natural compassion appears. A compassion that arises from realizing that we are all learning how to walk this path. And that realization transforms the way we relate to the world. Judgment begins to fade. Comparison begins to lose its power, and something lighter appears in its place. Curiosity. Curiosity about life. Curiosity about consciousness. Curiosity about the mystery of existence. And perhaps that is what makes this journey so extraordinary. It is not a path to becoming perfect. It is a path to becoming aware. And when awareness begins to bloom within you, something beautiful becomes clear. The journey was never about arriving somewhere. It was always about learning how to live more awake, more present, more authentic. Maybe that is why so many people feel, at some point in life, a quiet inner calling, a subtle feeling that there is something deeper to discover, something beyond the stories we learned, something beyond the identities we built. That calling is not a mistake. It is consciousness recognizing itself. And when you begin listening to that call more carefully, life begins revealing new paths. Paths that cannot be completely predicted, but can be lived with presence, with clarity, with authenticity. If this video resonated with you, perhaps it is because you are also walking this journey. A journey without a fixed destination, but one that deepens with every conscious step. If you want to continue exploring these ideas, stay connected with the next videos of this channel. Share this video with someone who may also be going through this process. And write one word in the comments that represents the phase you are living right now. Sometimes naming a phase is the first step to understanding it. And as always, gratitude for being here. Much light on your path. Quantum silence.